What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to the channel MessianicMeTV. It's been a long time since I made a pre-recorded video, but I want to update you guys on what's been going on in my life. But before we go ahead and dig into this video, if you're not yet part of the family, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because in this channel we talk all things Torah, Halakha, Jewish thought, and more. If you end up enjoying this video, make sure you give it a thumbs up, because it really does help the video and the channel. And of course, if you find that this video is share-worthy, make sure you share it with your friends and family. All right, let's go. All right, folks, let's go ahead and dive right into this. And in this video, what I want to do, like I mentioned, is just give you an update on where I stand currently. But before we get to that point, I want to give you a little bit of history about myself. My ancestors are Jewish, and this is something that many of you already know. But once they made it all the way to Central America, and there was a small Jewish community there, the family, my family, started pretty much losing the faith. Still, there was a recognition of God. And then, of course, being that part of Central America was so Christian, my family ended up becoming Christian, but not really in a practicing sense. Later on, my parents moved to New York, which is where I was born, and I continued to live my life in that type of life, which was a Christian lifestyle. My family became more and more devoted, and they were living in a Pentecostal Protestant Christian church. And this is pretty much the way that I was brought up for the majority of my youth. It wasn't around until the year 2010 when things really started changing for me. At this point in my life, I started questioning everything. I didn't want to believe something simply because that's the way that I was raised. Rather, I decided to challenge what I knew. This was a real leap of faith. But to do this, what I started to do is begin with the simple question of, does God exist? I started looking at different avenues to explore this, whether it would be with archaeological evidence, historical evidence, scientific evidence, and of course, philosophy played a huge role. As I was in this search, I looked at different religions. Now, just as a little parenthesis, just in case you are not a believer in God or in Yeshua, I mean no insult by this, but this is just simply the path that I have been on and where I stand now. The reason I say that is because as I began to look at all these different religions, I noticed things that were lacking. Either there was no historical evidence, or it was just full of myths, things that contradicted themselves, or things that contradicted science. And the more I studied, the more that I was able to scratch off certain beliefs. Then finally, I ended up acknowledging the fact that this God that we hear of, the God of Israel, the God of Abraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov, was indeed the true God. Then that led me into discovering more about the scriptures, how they came to be, how we came to acquire them in the different translations and all the different manuscripts. And then I was able to determine that indeed the scriptures that we have now are reliable. The next step was comparing what I was seeing in scripture versus the lifestyle that I was living. And immediately something stood out, and it was the fact that I was raised believing that our faith was a faith alone or sola fide type of relationship. But this was completely incorrect from what I saw, because the scriptures themselves, the only place where you see the words faith alone is when the scriptures tell you that we do not live by faith alone. Do not. So then this led me to understanding that our faith was not simply just believing. That's kind of abstract. But in fact, we have to walk out this lifestyle by obeying God's commandments. This led me into the world of Hebrew roots and Messianic Judaism. Of course, being that my background is Jewish, I decided to go down this path of Messianic Judaism. And it was amazing. I felt more attached to my heritage, and I was able to see that the faith was not just faith alone, but it involved faith and works together to express this belief in God and this relationship. And I lived like this for about a decade. But then, about a year and a half ago, things started to change again. And this happened as a result of me wanting to learn more about the earliest believers in Yeshua. You see, in the beginning, when I started digging into the faith, I started looking into the Jewish heritage because, of course, I saw the beauty in Judaism. So I kept kosher, I kept the feasts to the best of my ability, I wore tzitziot, kippot, I did the whole thing. But there was still something missing because everything that I was learning came from sources like the Mishnah or the Talmud, which are ancient Jewish writings. And while I did learn tremendous amounts of things and wonderful things, I was still lacking this part, which connected not just Temple Judaism to modern Judaism, but Temple Judaism to what the early believers in Yeshua practiced and lived. As I began to study, I started looking at the disciples of the apostles. This would include people such as Polycarp, who was a student of Yochanan. I started looking at people like Clement of Rome, who was a disciple of both Kepha and Shaul. This led me also into looking into Irenaeus and all of the early believers like Papias and more and more. From these folks known as the Apostolic Fathers, it led me to the pre-Nicene Fathers, which are the believers in Yeshua that came down the line, and this is before the Council of Nicaea. Specifically, I wanted to search this point because a lot of people told me that after the Council of Nicaea, that's when the church went downhill and it became pagan. But that's not at all what I saw. But I did notice some things that made me a little bit scared. And this is the fact that the more I looked into the faith, the more it started to look like something that I was taught to disagree with, to dislike, and even to hate. And this was Catholicism. You see, the way that I was brought up, I was taught that the Pope was basically the Antichrist. I was taught that Catholics were idol worshippers, that they were denying the sacrifice of Yeshua by partaking in the Eucharist. But this couldn't be further from the truth. And when I started to dive into these things, one of the things that really got to me was actually the Eucharist. In Greek, Eucharistia, and if you translate that to English, it just simply means thanksgiving, which is basically the partaking of the bread and wine that is blessed and becomes the body and blood of Yeshua. I studied this and I noticed that all the earliest believers believed this not just to be a symbol, but to be literally the body and blood of Yeshua. And while they did at some times speak of it as a symbol, it was always backed up in the saying that it was literally the body and blood of Yeshua, and that by partaking in this, you were partaking in Yeshua's sacrifice. This was amazing to me, and I couldn't believe that I was never taught this. And of course, coming from the Jewish background, it started tying up because I know that when I celebrated Pesach, I knew that even the rabbis told us that when we partake of the Pesach Seder, you're not just doing it remove thousands of years from the original Pesach, but that when you partake, you are actually there, because we know that our God is not bound by time and space. So the rabbis teach, like I mentioned, that when you partake of Pesach, you're partaking of that original Pesach. And in the same way, when we partake of the Eucharist, or how the early believers believed it, when they partook of the Eucharist, they were partaking in Yeshua's very same sacrifice at Golgotha. And that was just the beginning. Then I started looking into the authority of the church, and I noticed that the bishops that were the disciples of the disciples of the disciples of the apostles of Yeshua, all the way down the line to the Mashiach himself, this is an authority that was handed down from there. And this followed the same original structure that we saw all the way from the time of Moshe, where there was this thing called shmicha, the laying on of hands to transmit authority down the line. The rabbis tell us that the authority came from Moshe to Yehoshua, to the elders and the judges, all the way to the men of the great court, and from there to the rabbis. And I continue it, that it went from the high court, the Beit Din Hagadol, to the Mashiach himself, to the apostles, all the way down to the bishops, to the modern day bishops and priests. Now, in this video, I'm not gonna dive into the evidences and all the things that I learned in regards to this, but rather I'm just giving you an update onto what I believe. And to summarize it, I believe now what the Catholic Church teaches in its actual documented teachings. And of course, I'm not ignorant to the fact that there perhaps are people that take it too far and that use the Catholic faith in the wrong way. This happens in basically every faith. And as a matter of fact, in everything that involves humans, there is always a bad apple, or a few. But if I look at the teachings of the Catholic Church itself, what we know as the Catechism of the Catholic Church, it stands. And it's legit and everything agrees. And the more I looked into it, at first I was scared, but then I saw the beauty and the resemblance and proper continuation that came all the way from Temple Judaism all the way to the Catholic Church. So in an easy way to put this is saying that the Catholic Church is the fulfillment of Temple Judaism. And of course, I know that this might seem like a shock to some, like heresy to others, like a sad saying to some. But this is the truth that I have found. And it took me a lot of prayer, a lot of fasting, a lot of researching and studying, and a lot of going against my own beliefs. A lot of times we're afraid to research and search into these things because we think we know what's right. But at the end of the day, there are times where we are wrong. And this is what I noticed when I looked at the Catholic Church, where before I thought that the Catholic Church were idol-worshipping, Pope-obeying, Antichrist-following heretics. And it turns out that that was just simply wrong. So I invite you to look into these things yourself, and perhaps you think you have. I thought I had, but I was wrong because I was doing it with a biased heart. But when you go into it searching simply for the truth, and when you take the truth of Temple Judaism and see what Yeshua did, because God was taking the Jewish people, the Israelites, from a theocratic nation all the way to a global kingdom. So by necessity, some things had to change, but equally, there were some things that had to flow. And this is what we see when we look at things like the sacrifice, the priesthood, and the temple. Now, I know that this is a lot of things to cover, and there's a lot more to be said. So I'm excited to let you all know that in this channel, where we do talk about Torah, Halakha, Jewish thought, and more, now we're going to go into this journey together to explore how Temple Judaism flows right into Catholicism. It's amazing, and I can't wait to share all of this with you. Of course, if you have any questions and comments, let me know in the comment section below. I'd love to see your thoughts and opinions. But of course, refrain from using hateful language. This is a place where we grow and learn together. And I've also opened myself up to do video chats with you guys. And if you ever want to email me, go ahead. My email is, just like this channel, MessianicMeTV@gmail.com. But again, I hope that you guys enjoyed this video as I update you and let you know straight up what I believe, as I am in the way to becoming Catholic. And that feels so good to say and to finally admit it. But of course, I just took time because I wanted to make sure that I'm not just doing this out of a biased heart, out of confusion, out on a whim, but I wanted to make sure and test things. And if you feel as a brother or sister in Messiah that perhaps I have missed something, let me know. Of course, I will say this off the bat. A lot of the messages that I've already received are things I've already tackled, but I will address them in videos later on. But things like, the papacy, the idol worshipping, the whole Marian thing, these are things that of course I have looked into. So please don't think that I just went into it ignorantly. But I'm happy to talk about it if you would like to talk about it too. All right, folks, I hope you enjoyed this video. And if you did, make sure you give it a thumbs up. Thank you so much for watching. Have a blessed week. Shalom.